Okay, so welcome to our webinar on Edge. Good morning for those of you joining us from the Americas. Good afternoon, those from Europe, Middle East and Africa. Good evening, those of you who have taken the trouble to join us from Asia. And if you're in Australia, good grief, it's really late. And if you're up watching the cricket, go to bed because you've won anyway. So coming back to today, what we've got here is a great session following up on some of the earlier webinars we've done on edge computing. And today's focus is really going to be much more about edge computing from the front line. In other words, looking at what developers are up to and some case studies and some learnings from actual developer engagement with edge computing. So we've got our presenters today are Geoff from MobiledgeX and Dalia, my colleague from STL Partners, and myself, Philip Laidler. I'll be moderating this and I'll be taking on the questions and managing those later on in the session. So the first session, we're going to hear from Geoff, who's going to update us on the edge computing landscape, how that's evolving, and what the key developments have been for those who are trying to build applications on edge today. Then Dalia is going to take us through some of the insights we gained from our research program, and that's speaking with the edge startups. And then we're going to wrap up with some Q&A. So that's what we've got in store for you. Just a little bit of guidance on this particular GoToWebinar platform. Those of you who are not familiar with it, just let everyone know that you're in listen-only mode and you're going to remain in listen-only mode. If you need to contact us, then please do go ahead and type a comment. As you can see from our arrow up there on 1, that's where you can expand the button and you can put some questions. Please do type your questions. We will be going through the questions at the end. And also, if you're getting any issues, although you're muted, you may want to notify us if you're having problems with sound. What we do recommend is you use a headset that's connected to a USB port, and you can sort of look at that with arrow 2 to those settings. If you're unable to manage those settings, contact us and see what we can do. If not, you do that. Before we get started, and before we kick things off, I just want to do a little bit of a poll, find out who we've got on the call today. I know a lot of people signed up, so we've already got a good audience building up steam, 70 of you and counting. What I just want to get is a little bit of feedback from the audience on what are the big questions that your organization is facing in tackling, thinking about, evaluating edge computing. So you should have this poll, and we'd like you to select one of these between, what are the use cases that are going to drive edge computing in the short term? Where's the money? How do we monetize this? How do we need to build edge? What are the platforms? Who do we partner with? And then there's a lot of folks who are trying to figure out what the relationship or the impact will be on the edge computing we'll have on 5G and vice versa. So if you would like to just select your response, and we will quickly close the poll and see the results. Okay, so it sounds like a lot of the audience are here today, and there are almost 80 of you, so good turnout. Thank you for joining. A lot of the audience here today are interested in understanding use cases, short-term use cases, the ones that developers are working on. What's the real stuff? Where is their real, genuine interest in using edge compute? Some want to try and figure out where the money is, and the third biggest one is trying to figure out how it all fits together with 5G. Okay, that's helpful, and that's a bit of context, which I will now hand over to Geoff Hollingworth, who's the Chief Marketing Officer for MobiledgeX. I hope most of you know about MobiledgeX. If not, maybe Geoff, it would be helpful if you did a brief intro just to introduce the company for those who've joined and who are not familiar with MobiledgeX and the work.
Thank you, Phil. For all of the people not familiar with MobiledgeX, we are founded by Deutsche Telekom, about 18 months old now, and we are building a platform to allow developers to access the edge as easily as possible with the native developer approach and developer tools. So what's important for us from our business model, and it's the focus of the webinar today, is to understand the actual edge computing landscape and model in the short, medium, and long term. And the reason that we are passionate for this as a company is because this is our core business. Can we just progress the slide forward? Actually, on the, I'm still seeing an old slide. There we go, perfect, thank you. So I'm not sure if all of you are aware, but about 6 months ago, we released all of our internal research about the edge use cases that we had discovered and the logic. And we packaged that up in something called the MobiledgeX Navigator. So if you go to mobiledgex.com, you can see the Navigator on a link at the top bar, and you can see our research. And we got a lot of good feedback from that. And what we are now doing is opening up this thought process across other partners and other industry members to try and make one consistent model of what we believe the edge market will develop as. And this is a very high-level overview of how we are approaching this process. And I just want to share this because then Dalia will go through interviews and companies that she's been working with where we have looked and tested this model and see if it makes sense. The first observation that I think is very important for us to understand is that there are multiple edges, and those edges have existed for a long time. And the majority of enablement today is actually a combination of a device edge that's quite often a smartphone and the internet edge where a public cloud sits. And we see what happens in the middle, either through the network edge or the on-premise edge, in terms of the bandwidth, especially on the network side. So what we have tried to do, and we'll have some examples of this, is start to model different use cases based on how they're possible to implement across these different edges. And each edge has a strength and a weakness. For example, the device edge is the most immediate edge available for processing because obviously it's on device. The challenge then is, of course, that the device becomes more expensive, it becomes heavier, the batteries don't last as long, but you can make a device that works according to what you need to go all the way back to the internet edge, but you are compromising what you need to do. The on-premise edge allows a gradual rollout of edge infrastructure rather than a ubiquitous supply initially. And we see a lot of activity there as enterprises transform with new experiences, for example, in retail, around product placement and try before you buy, AR, VR examples that are already significantly changing sell-through for those retailers that are putting those solutions out there. And then the big promise that leads into 5G and a new economic model for mobile operators is around the network edge. And the interesting part about the network edge is actually the net new edge. And the value of the network edge is potentially outsourcing, removing on-premise infrastructure where possible. And we're in these conversations where edge solutions can be mirrored in network and on-premise, depending on the scenario that you're in. And also it potentially allows things to be delivered as a service, again, at a completely different price point to a much smaller company, small to medium business, rather than, say, in the example of retail, a Target or Walmart. The other key point that we want to bring out here is that the only people that speak about edge use cases explicitly and 5G use cases tend to be on the supply side. When we speak to people in industries, they're speaking about how they increase the top line, how they increase engagement, footfall. They are talking about business survival, and the intensity of that is increasing. So part of this process is not asking people about edge computing and 5G directly, it's asking them about what success looks like for them inside their industry and how they can actually take a lead or disrupt where they are. And then there are innovation enablers that allow people to do that, be it AR, VR, be it drones, be it private LTE, be it robotic inventory management. And the combination of those two things lead to use cases that then indicate what kind of capability is required to enable those use cases to exist. And that's where the edge factors come in. And what we're trying to model here is whether, is it really a latency-driven market? Is it managed latency that's more important in terms of predictability? Is it actually a bandwidth problem? Is it a data residency problem, a clustering problem? So there's a discipline that we follow through to understand consistently across all use cases how these things start to appear in different industries with different enablers. And then the last two steps, which I think are the most important to our company, I would suggest to all of us on the call, is that either a solution exists today that can be improved, or it wasn't possible to do what's being promised and it's a completely new solution. And there is a roadmap over the next 1 year, 2 year, 3 years on potentially how you can change that solution by playing different edges against each other for different economics and different investments. And all of this becomes packaged into a model that we are putting out in the market called Seamster, where we can all contribute to actually understanding economic thresholds, where we can understand demand in 1 year, in 2 years, and 3 years, and it can affect actually where we potentially want to invest in terms of solutions and also invest in terms of infrastructure density, when and where. So on that note, this was giving you a landscape of a consistent way that's demand driven on how to view edge use cases in a complete format. At this point, I'd like to hand it over to Dalia to actually go through different companies and different results that you will see a model in this.
Thanks, Geoff. So yeah, following on from what Geoff said, hi everyone, this is Dalia from SDL Partners. We recently did a sort of a research program where we wanted to move beyond these kind of hypothetical assumptions about where demand for edge computing is, and thinking about things in sort of use case terms and moving closer to sort of real applications. And the way to do that is to speak to those who are sort of actively exploring edge. Just to, I guess, quickly just to touch on the companies that we spoke to. So we spoke to about 7, both sort of software application developers and also in some cases infrastructure providers who had a view on kind of their experiences around edge. We spoke to 3 companies, so 1000 Realities, HoloLight, and Visio, who are in the kind of AR, VR, mixed reality domain, and they're all to some degree providing solutions and applications for primarily enterprise augmented reality sort of scenarios. So things like using AR for design and collaboration in design and engineering, and in some cases it's also in consumer applications too. We had a couple of companies who I would say are more in the kind of application optimization or video optimization domain, and really pushing, I guess, what what's maybe traditionally called CDN to the next level. So we have Section, who have an edge compute platform where they allow their customers who are developers to run workloads wherever makes sense for them. And then also Smart Mobile Labs, who have a solution for enabling real-time video streaming in sort of specific situations like live events and sport venues. The last two companies, Atris is a sort of infrastructure developer who's developing a solution to enable the kind of autonomous drone navigation market, and I guess allow a system to be realized where we can see drones move autonomously through the air and also be able to collect and analyze that data from drones in real time. And then the last company is Radius Networks, who use real-time location-based information for solutions within hospitality mainly. So it's things like they have an application where in a restaurant a customer can go up to the counter, make an order, and then the waiter knows exactly where the customer is and can then deliver their order without the use of any additional equipment. So I guess the first thing to sort of note is these companies are obviously at different stages of exploring edge computing, and they're not all looking at the same edge, let's say. And I don't want to go into too much detail around defining edge, but in a similar way to what Geoff was saying, there are different edges where you have devices, obviously the closest point to the end user, and the cloud, which is the most remote point. I guess the new domain is the network edge, and the interviews and the companies we looked at are probably more skewed towards exploring the network edge in particular as this sort of new venture. But we also had some who are looking at the on-premise edge as well. In terms of level experience and where they are and how advanced are they in using edge. So we've kind of come up with this continuum where you have those who are still exploring what edge means, and this is, I guess, at the first stage, understanding, gaining some level of insight of what the capabilities of edge are, and therefore what the potential implications could be on their business or their application. And as you move from left to right, the company starts to engage partners, run technical trials and proof of concepts to test the technology, and then eventually integrate code and be able to leverage edge for their solutions and take that to market and eventually scale. So from the companies we looked at, the two probably who are most advanced are Radius Networks and Section, and that's partly because most of the others are looking at the network edge, which is obviously kind of in its infancy. What's interesting about Section is that one of their key proposition is providing these developers with lots of different options for where they want to deploy their workloads. And currently, I would say most of the locations they can offer sit somewhere between the cloud and the network, and in maybe traditional locations where you would find CDN. But now they're looking at the network edge as a real differentiator and something that they would like to offer their customers to continuously improve performance, make their end customers' applications more scalable, more secure, etc. And they're kind of working with partners like Vapor.io at the moment in the US to start to sort of figure out what the implications of network edge could be on their business. We've also, we did speak to obviously Smart Mobile Labs. They, I would say, have a fairly commercial offering in what they're doing around video optimization, and they have customers who are companies like stadiums, event venues, who are actively using those real-time video streaming capabilities. At the moment, it's not yet using the public network edge, but it's certainly using more private network, private LTE with an edge node running on a base station on that private LTE network. And the others are kind of moving quickly. There's they see a real need for using network edge. So these are the guys in the AR VR space, Atris in the drone space. They're actively testing the technology and starting to integrate it into what they offer. So obviously I saw in the poll a lot of the interest from our attendees today is around use cases, and I guess the question around use cases is always why is there demand for a certain piece of technology? And as I think Geoff referenced, there are these edge factors that we've looked at, which we consider for, what are the key capabilities of edge that an application or a solution may demand that lend themselves to bringing the processing capabilities closer to them and kind of moving it closer than the cloud. And what we hear, I guess, time and time again is latency. And I would say from the interviews that we had, latency does come up with it does come up as one of the critical factors, but there's other things going on. So here, I think Geoff referenced this idea of reducing bandwidth and reducing the need to move traffic back and forth in order to enable an application. That's what we mean by heavy I/O, and that's very important for applications like video-based applications. So whether that's smart mobile labs with video optimization, or the AR, VR companies and startups, the real factor here is being able to not have to move all that data back and forth. There are some other factors. So particularly with a network edge, you have capabilities where you're able to use the location information from the network kind of readily and be able to accurately dictate where a device is or where the end user is, and that's kind of important for certain applications, particularly drones. If we're talking about this unmanned traffic management, or being able to enable drones to autonomously navigate across the skies, clearly the drone needs to know where it is in order to do that. The one below this, hyperlocal grouping, this is a kind of an extension of that, where you need to know the location of a device relative to what's other devices around it, and also the environment around it, and be able to coordinate sort of fleets of devices. Again, this idea of drone navigation does leverage this in particular, but it could be applicable in other domains. So where it could be where an event venue is trying to coordinate different sort of attendees. It can provide a specific experience for those attendees. And the last one is data residency. And this is partly driven by kind of data sovereignty. And in some cases, enterprises want to keep their data local within a certain jurisdiction and not host it in the cloud. But in other cases, it's at an even more local level, where in certain industries, particularly manufacturing, they want to keep their data very close to their site. Usually it's on site, and they don't want any of their sort of operational data and processes leaving the site. So the main thing here is that it's not necessarily just about latency, and each use case and each application developer sees a different reason why they're adopting edge. So deep diving into latency in a bit more details, we did get some interesting data points from the developers for how what are their specific latency requirements. Here we've got an example from the VR space, and this is for, these are sort of quotes from 1000 Realities, which is one of the companies we spoke to. The first thing is that you can see from the numbers here that there are quite stringent requirements to be able to render the models that will be viewed through the headset from an edge node. So to be able to do that effectively, so that the individual wearing the headset can move, and then the image is rendered in real time. For 2D modeling, that requires 33 milliseconds, and they said if you take that to 3D modeling, which is used in some of their customers, where the end users are kind of designers and engineers who are collaborating on a 3D model together, that goes all the way down to 20 milliseconds. So even though it's a massive 30 milliseconds, there is a difference. And what they found in some of their tests that they're doing around edge computing is that when they use the public LTE network and use an edge node on the public LTE network, they are able to achieve 20 to 25 milliseconds latency, which is fine for the 2D model rendering. But they're only at the moment able to get down to below 20 milliseconds when they're leveraging edge on a private LTE network, and really bringing the number of hops down that traffic has to go through and for the application to work. What's come out through this interview program is how much nuance there is when you dig into these applications. So, you know, a lot of the time, I would say in the industry, we sort of lump AR, VR, mixed reality all together and try and come up with some broad brush generalizations of the needs in these different domains. Another company, so Arvisio, who is focusing on mixed reality or is looking at mixed reality as one of their application domains, they were saying that for mixed reality, you don't need these stringent latency levels, and that's because in mixed reality, the user has, you know, they can see what's in front of them, and what's happening is there is some kind of image or information that's overlaid on top, and for that they have what's in front of them as a frame of reference. So if they turn and there's a slight delay with what's being augmented on top, that's not a huge issue. And for them, they're kind of looking more at 100 millisecond latency for their requirements. Another example is in the in the sort of drone space. Atrius as well is starting to test how their kind of infrastructure could work and how they're using edge to enable this autonomous navigation of drones. At the moment, what they're saying is that if you use an LTE network without edge, then you're looking at more than 100 milliseconds latency. And you know, they've given a specific quote here where their tests are happening in Austin. The issue is that most of the mobile operators hand off outside in Dallas to Houston, and that's part of the reason why there's this delay. What they really need to get to initially, it's 100. They're looking at 100 milliseconds to sort of do some initial tests for how the drones could communicate with one another. But ultimately, once this sort of drone navigation system is scaled, they really need kind of down to 20 to 50 milliseconds. And this goes down even further to 1 to 10 milliseconds when you're doing things like taking the video data from drones and augmenting some kind of information or image overlay on top of that. That needs to happen, in real time and very, very quickly. So the whole thing has very strict latency requirements. And again, going back to this point of the nuances and the needs, and I think this goes back to Geoff's point that it is useful to look at the technical capabilities that these applications are leveraging and why they're using edge. The other thing is also to look at it from a kind of a business angle and to understand, for the application developer who's trying to do something different, who's trying to potentially enter a new market, why are they using edge, and how does it change their processes? How does it change their business model to set them apart? And looking at this again, this sort of augmented reality space as a specific example, where they're rendering the images and the models from a network edge node. One of the in addition to what we've said already, one of the real differentiators for an application that will leverage the network edge is that it fundamentally changes the hardware that is used for AR and VR. So today, if the customer wants to use AR and VR, it tends to mean that you're using a very heavy device or a heavy headset, which could be a HoloLens, which is doing all that processing on the headset itself. Or in some cases, it might be tethered to a nearby computer. And there are clearly issues with that. First, with the first example, the problem is that the form factor is not quite right. People find it quite heavy. You can't use a headset for long periods of time. And in the second situation, it kind of just makes it the end user has to be situated in one place, and that's not great. Where we have some use cases in this domain, so things like a field force worker, if they wanted to use an augmented reality headset to assist them with a particular task, a maintenance task, for example, if it needs to be tethered, then that's a huge headache for them, and it doesn't make it user friendly. Another thing that came up was around sort of storage, and again, by processing the data off the device itself, you don't come into some of the problems around security related to storing the data on the headset itself. And these are potentially sensitive customers. So again, the use cases here are things like designers, engineers collaborating on something that they are on a product that they're designing. Clearly, there's some that's IP that shouldn't be taken outside of the site, should not be stored on the device that has the potential risk to be stolen. And the last thing is around scalability. So one of the challenges that these guys have at the moment is a lot of the time these devices are connected over Wi-Fi, and so what that means is that they have to kind of enter a customer site and somehow try and hook up to the customer's internal Wi-Fi system. And sometimes the customer flat out doesn't allow it, and in other cases it just takes a long time, and there's a kind of a bit of an overhead in terms of deploying one of these solutions. So the thing with using the network edge and using mobile networks is obviously it makes it more scalable. They can easily deploy this to lots of different customers. And so this is just a flavor of how, when you look at some of the business problems, edge kind of plays a role there as well. Taking that point a bit further, so again, looking at the broad, looking at these 7 companies that we've interviewed, ultimately these guys are startups, and as I sort of said, they have an ambition to either provide new services or disrupt a market and do something different. Otherwise, they don't survive. So that's why it's important to look at the business problem and then look at to what extent edge is important in solving that business problem. So at a high level, you have, in terms of the domains that we've looked at here, you've got Atrius, who's in the drone space, and our Visio, HoloLight, 1000 Realities, who are in the AR VR space. These guys are quite, fundamentally changing the way the market works, changing business models, and creating and disrupting the market quite substantially. And that's their core ambition. And then you have Section, Smart Mobile Labs, Radius Networks, who are really trying to, again, change the processes, but it's primarily around improving what happens today. So with Smart Mobile Labs, for example, they are providing a much better way to deliver real-time streaming of video data. And just to kind of exemplify this point, for Atrius, they want, what they are changing is, for what they're focusing on is governments and sort of public sector bodies who have traditionally found it quite hard to monitor their assets and their infrastructure using traditional methods and manual inspections. What they would like to do is create this autonomous system using drones that monitors assets and infrastructure continuously and creates this continuous flowing data pipeline. And that's fundamentally quite different. The other thing is, on the other side is, to what extent is edge the critical factor in enabling this ambition? And taking Section as an example, their core ambition and their proposition is around providing their developer customers access to servers wherever, whenever, and however they need to optimize their end applications and websites and such. And they are, they see the network edge in this case. So Section obviously provides lots of different edges, but if we're talking about the network edge, it's kind of one potential aspect of their portfolio. And you can argue that the fact that they're using containers and the fact that they are a software player and therefore hardware agnostic is the sort of the real driving technology that allows them to fulfill their proposition. Great. So just sort of moving on, the last part is just what does this mean then for telecoms operators? I think Phil just has a quick...
Yeah, so just thank you very much for that, Dalia. And Dalia's just going to wrap up in a moment with the implications. But in the meanwhile, I would like to invite everyone to put your questions. So if you recall, if you click on the right arrow above on your screens on the webinar and enter your questions, we will be collating them and have the opportunity to ask those questions in the final part of this webinar. So please go ahead, enter your questions. We will introduce the question with their first name and we will put those questions to Geoff and Dalia. So please go ahead and do that in the next few minutes while Dalia wraps up with the implications for operators.
Thanks, Phil. Yeah, so I mean, just bringing this back, I guess, to the industry that we're in, and sort of the so what aspect of what these developers are saying. And I think it's, I mean, one thing that we've learned is that there is demand for edge computing. It's still relatively new, but there are still some challenges. In particular, here we're talking about the network edge, I would say. And so some of the challenges that were highlighted by the interviewees, they sort of span a broad spectrum. The first thing is that these developers are looking to create an application, to create a solution that can scale and can ultimately target a large addressable market. The challenge for them today is that it's great that they're doing some tests, they're learning about how edge compute can help, but they really need to access more edge compute locations. And at the moment, at least the guys that we've spoken to, most of the test beds seem to be in the US and Europe. And so, for them, they would really like to see that there are edge clouds or network edge clouds available in different markets, and for them to be able to have sort of sufficient infrastructure to then launch these applications that leverage the network edge. The other thing is around hardware, and this is I guess this is interesting for operators or other ecosystem players who are thinking about how do we build the edge, how do we build the facilities and the stack that goes at these edge nodes on the network. And it's trying to get a balancing act with providing something that is cloud-like and therefore gain some forms of economies of scale. One of the challenges is that the requirements, the sort of hardware requirements of the developers do vary. And so in some cases, the applications can sit on fairly kind of generic infrastructure using x86 servers and such. In other cases, and particularly where a lot of these applications require image processing and fairly significant compute, HoloLight, for example, was saying that we need NVIDIA GPUs and even specific forms of operating systems, and that just has that kind of, I guess, bears food for thought for operators and those who are thinking about what do we need to put into our edge nodes, and it's not necessarily a one size fits all. And I guess this goes back to the point of it does depend on which use cases you want to prioritize or which markets you want to target with your edge compute infrastructure. The third thing is kind of around not just, I guess, the developer accessing and there being a supply of edge clouds, but also them being able to have some sort of a platform that allows them to manage their workloads effectively. And this is because, in reality, first of all, you've got different edges sort of going up and down from the cloud to the device. But then also, if we look at the network edge, it is likely to be fragmented across different operators, and each operator will have their own infrastructure sitting at the on their network. And so the developers do see this as a potential problem. How can they orchestrate their workloads across these different operators, across these different edges? The other thing that was brought up is the fact that in some cases you may want to burst or you may want to use network edge temporarily. So there really needs to be this level of dynamism in how workloads and applications can move up and down and across edges. The last 2 points. The first thing, pricing. This is more of an uncertainty, but at the moment, because of where we are with network edge, no one knows how much it will cost, and that's a challenge for developers as they sort of have to make a decision between performance and cost. At the moment, it's difficult to make that decision because there's not really an indication of how much it's going to cost them. And the last thing is a little bit about networks. And in some cases in here, this is a quote from Atris, but it was brought up in other interviews as well, which is saying that partly because of the latency requirements, but also in some cases kind of the mission critical nature of certain applications. The network needs to be reliable, and there are suggestions that they would need to have isolated virtual or non-virtual networks for certain sets of use cases to ensure that the needs are met consistently. So I think on that note, we've got a second poll, and here we just wanted to get everyone's thoughts on sort of these challenges that I've just presented and which one you think is the most difficult challenge for operators to overcome in particular. So I mean, there are kind of other challenges that we've not listed here, but partly because of the number of responses we can have, we've combined them to these 5. But just to go through them again one by one. So the options are, first, is it around edge cloud availability and making sure that you can supply enough edge cloud and have sufficient capacity so that developers can build applications that really scale within a market or across different markets. The second one is hardware. So to what extent is it easy to meet the demand around different processing power needs and different requirements at the edge infrastructure sites. Third thing, platforms and policies. So can operators provide some of these mechanisms for orchestrating workloads, or can they work with partners to do that in an easy way? And the fourth one, pricing. So is there a clear price point for edge compute that it reflects the performance benefits that it brings, or is it still quite uncertain? And then the last thing is about network. So can the networks evolve to meet some of these stringent latency needs in particular? So I think we have some votes coming in. Sure. Okay, we've got half of you who voted so far, so I don't know if we can get a few more in and then we can see what the results look like. So yeah, I mean, this is obviously from an operator standpoint, and some of the operators who are on the call today may not be thinking about this yet, but it's interesting to get your views as well as others in the industry of what you think may be most difficult to overcome. I think we can show the results. Okay. Okay, so interestingly enough, I mean, I would say unsurprisingly, the platform and the policies factor is the most difficult. And I mean, you can argue that this is probably a capability that is most distant from what operators do today. So there are others, particularly in the cloud space, whether it's the hyperscale cloud providers or others who have the skills and the capabilities to provide these platforms and policies. And it may not be that the operators provide it themselves, but they need to partner with others. But I can see how this could be a particularly difficult challenge to overcome. The other one, I mean, it's interesting to see that edge cloud availability is a challenge, because in some ways that's something that the operators have control over. And I guess it's up to you to build out those edge sites. But I assume that this is because there's still a lack of clarity of what's the around the business case, or when is it appropriate to build these edge clouds? How does it link with 5G deployments and all that kind of thing? So yeah, thanks everyone for providing your feedback there. Last bit of the presentation is just a bit about the old question of monetization models, and we've looked at some of the feedback from these developers, but what does it mean for operators in terms of building some level of business case for deploying edge facilities and edge infrastructure? And this came from the interviews we spoke to, and the companies we spoke to, who provided their view on where telcos can play. And at a broad level, there's probably 2 ways of looking at this. One, which is improving your core business, and this could be about reducing costs and optimizing how the network works by processing, particularly high bandwidth data deeper in the network to avoid it moving all the way through the core and to the cloud. But it can also be about improving customer experience. So it could be around specific examples where Smart Mobile Labs has a kind of solution where an operator can improve how the real-time video streaming in a stadium experience or in an event, and in that way they provide a superior experience compared to their competitors in that specific scenario. The other, I guess, area is building new services, and this could span from network services, and that's related to some of these points that there are some specific network requirements that certain applications need. It may be about providing edge cloud platforms and the infrastructure, or some way of accessing the infrastructure and other capabilities. And then the highest point of the value chain is providing those end application solutions. Some of which, a lot of these use cases are around increasing the use of data. So there are some kind of data management solutions that Radius Network suggested telcos could provide, or also could be, specific applications within specific domains, like providing navigation and navigation and timing services for enabling drones to navigate autonomously. Great. So that's the end of my presentation. I guess now we go to the questions section.
Yeah, sorry, apologise about the phone there. Thank you very much, Dalia. Thanks for that, both yourself and Geoff, for racing through a huge amount of materials. We have lots of questions. First up, there are a couple of questions regarding, and I forgot to mention this, that this will be recorded, and we will, so just to let everyone know that that will happen. The next thing I'd like to do is run through some of the questions. Thank you all for submitting your questions. There are been sent in. So I'll just start with some of the earlier ones. I think there's a sort of one or two questions regarding clarifications of terminology, I'd say. So we have a question from Sylvain, who's just asking, actually, no, this is, sorry, more about sort of services, I think, and pricing. So Sylvain was asking, in the compute edge, the network edge, what are startup expecting to find in terms of services? And I think the question there is really, what are their expectations, Geoff, in terms of what do they think they're going to find, what sort of services are they expecting, and possibly, I know there's another question later on today around any expectations around pricing. Is that not yet something that they've got to?
Yeah, so let me take the first question, perhaps around the expectations. And the way that we approach developer architectures when we speak to them is that they are currently building their application architectures in an increasingly distributed way. And parts of their backend they want to run as close to the served user as possible. Be it for authentication reasons, be it for interpretation reasons. And so that the base service that starts with is the enablement in a business-driven way to actually place that edge tier dynamically close to the user that's being served. And obviously, that sounds like an easy problem until you realize that the majority of the users for these people are potentially mobile, or they are over a number of on-premise sites as well. So that has to be handled dynamically, and that's where the business policy question that people picked up on, which I thought that was quite interesting. Now then, the next evolution is obviously some of those services that people are currently implementing in their vertically integrated application development can be horizontalized and delivered from the edge. So when we start looking at different frameworks and different enablers, then parts of those frameworks should actually start to move to the edge. So for example, in the gaming space, you either do it with Unreal or with Unity. Parts of those engines should seamlessly be running at the edge. And that's not something a developer has to design for, the engine actually takes care of it. Similar on the high performance database, we're having a very early but interesting discussion around the Redis edge from a data thinning point of view. So what we think will develop, and this is why we're keen to industrialize the process to discover use cases, is that certain services will be best served being horizontalized across a network infrastructure. And then obviously, discovering those services and providing those services is good for developers and also good for the network operators that are actually providing them. From a commercial point of view, it is still an open question from a network edge. Our modeling that we have done has shown that there is a propensity to buy at a premium to cloud if the performance can deliver what's required. And then the elasticity of that premium to cloud is depending on the applications and the use cases. The most interesting place that we are seeing innovation happening at the moment is actually around people who are doing transformation on-premise. And the industries there who are absolutely needing to introduce a much more competitive digital experience out of their own business needs. And they want to do that in a way where they can implement it and be independent of on-premise versus running that tier in other locations if the opportunity comes up. And there, of course, the commercial model is a little bit easier today in the sense that it's a dedicated infrastructure that's on premise.
Okay, thank you for that, Geoff. Just coming out with a couple other questions. One from Jean-Christophe, I think that's more terminology. I'm going to direct this to Dalia. Could you re-explain the difference between network edge and cloud edge?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, I guess it's really around where the processing is happening. With the cloud edge, where we're talking about sort of mainly hyperscale data centers, which could be provided by traditional, I guess, cloud providers like AWS and Azure, or other data center infrastructure providers. The network edge is about running these potentially mini data centers or accessing servers which are on the telcos network. So I suppose it's similar to how you define multi-access edge compute. And so we're not necessarily only talking about the mobile network here, it could be on the fixed network here. And again, in these interviews, it wasn't so specific around where exactly on the network edge will these compute locations be. That's kind of not the developers. That's not front of mind for the developers. They just want that they're kind of more concerned about how the application looks and where makes sense for them based on the performance requirements and the scalability requirements of the end application. But I hope that sort of clarifies things at a high level.
Yeah, thanks. Another quick definitional one, maybe for you, Geoff. This is from Andre, who's just asked what the mechanism is in which the geospatial knowledge actually creates the need for edge compute. So I guess it's trying to understand how does geospatial knowledge, or the need for geospatial knowledge, create or demand for edge compute?
Yes, and maybe a key phrase that we see turning up both in enterprise applications like fleet management or drone swarming, or in consumer around multiplayer gaming, is something that's referred to as a SLAM backend, which is simultaneous location and mapping. So what's happening is that as these numbers of these devices are using video information in real time to actually orientate themselves versus other devices or versus their surroundings, then the feedback loop where they are sharing that fidelity of information becomes a very tight loop to build the experience. So for example, if you were in a multiplayer gaming where you are all looking from a slightly different perspective at a generated object in the middle, what we see is the desire to share just location updates at say a 50 hertz kind of frequency. And when you start doing that, then immediately the actual bandwidth and sensitivity to that sharing of the location affects the experience directly. Where you see this a lot, there's a growing phenomena in gaming is around this concept of occlusion, where you can actually hide behind a Harry Potter magic cloak. And obviously, if there's any delays in this, then you're not hidden very well.
Okay, thanks for that. I'm conscious of time. I just want to get a few more questions in. A question from John, who's actually asked several questions, so I'm going to try and address the one and pass it back to Dalia. John's asked a couple of questions relating to who is actually driving decisions regarding edge within, I guess, application providers or developers. Is it technology? Is it business? Who are the key people driving decisions? And I think associated with that and connected to that, John also has asked, you know, to what extent do end users really want to manage and manage the management layer regarding edge, or is this something that that they want to outsource, or is it something in between? So I guess there were two questions there from John. If you can take those both on, Dalia.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I guess on the first one, I mean, based on the roles of the people we spoke to, I would say it's a mixture. So in some cases, I suppose if they're at a relatively early stage of looking at edge, it usually does tend to be driven from the technology departments where, you know, I guess on an ongoing basis, they're looking at how they can leverage new technologies to improve their services. But I guess the thing to point out is these are startups, and a few of these startups, so thinking about Atris, Smart Mobile Labs, and some of the AR VR guys in particular, their raison d'etre is to use the edge, and so, you know, it's sort of ingrained in their DNA that they want to use edge, and so I guess it's taken a different approach. It's not necessarily that they are an established business which is looking at doing something new and therefore being driven out of different business units. A lot of the time, it's kind of their founder has made the decision to pursue edge as a sort of an opportunity. And the second question, sorry, if you could just, yes. The second question was around end users and how they want to manage, control or outsource it. I mean, I think in general, there's a kind of a halfway house where I think a lot of the time it will be around them being able to set some kind of performance parameters. So, you know, for example, if they need some level of latency that's consistent, they want a behind the scenes policy to determine where best their workloads should go. There are probably some exceptions. So again, so Section as an example, because they are providing the edge compute platform, they are likely to want more of that control. So it sort of depends. So probably if you're a platform provider, you want more of the control. If you're the end application, you want to focus on developing a sort of a custom experience in the application itself.
So just one more question, and by the way, we will try and answer these questions and send a summary. So I'm afraid we've not had time to answer all the questions, but we will try to get back to all of you who kindly put submitted the questions with some responses, and we will send that after this. But for the last remaining couple of minutes, I want to pass the last question back to Geoff, and that's from Dave. And Dave's asked, how can telcos compete on edge at a global level, where many use cases are inherently global in nature? Where should telcos focus investments in a way that leverages their regional assets?
Yeah, that's a really good question. That's very close to our heart inside MobiledgeX, because the one promise we need to make sure is that the developers can access the network edge in as simple and easy way as possible. And what that really means is that is seamless in terms of how they are developing their applications in cloud today. So one philosophy we have is that cloud applications, be they existing or new, they'll all be born in the cloud, and they will be architected in the way that allows them to seamlessly distribute when that's required. So part of it is making sure that there's a single pane of glass that gives access to that global infrastructure. The second part then for the network operators is what is the cadence on the densification of the rollout of edge? We don't believe that that we want to roll out lots of infrastructure in advance of a demand. Part of our function and the focus of this webinar is to understand demand and then a minimum footprint that then can scale as it scales naturally.
Thank you very much. Thank you both, Dalia and Geoff. Thank you all of those of you who've joined and dialed in. I think it's been a really cram-packed hour, and we will be sharing the results, both in terms of all the polls, but also the slides and the recording of this for you to share with your colleagues. And we will also be attempting to answer questions which we have not been able to address all of them, but some very good ones. Thank you. Good afternoon, good morning for some of you still, good evening, and well, you should be asleep if you're in Australia. Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.